Hello, everyone. I've just started this seminar at the end of the first day of the language show on using your language skills to work as a translator for the European Union. We'll just wait for a minute or two to let people in. If there's anybody in already, if you could maybe say hello in the chat where you're listening from, where you are, just so I know there is somebody out there. Nothing yet, so perhaps I'm speaking to an empty room. Hello, Sergio's from Spain. Liliane from France. Okay, good to know that there are people out there. So we'll leave it a couple of minutes to let people come in, and then I'll do an introduction and get into the presentation, and I'll share my screen. I will have a slideshow for you. Romania, lovely. Chris from the UK. London, France, Budapest. Jó estét kívánok. Mary Jane in the UK. Köszönöm, Nora. Okay, so we've got quite a few people. I make it 2 minutes. Let's see, we'll only go to 3 minutes or so, and then I'll start the presentation, and perhaps there will be people that come in after that. Once I start talking, I'm not going to be able to monitor the chat. So I'm going to ask you to put some questions in, and hopefully at the end we will have time for you to ask questions to me. I hope it'll generate lots of questions and we'll have time to go through some of them. But I'm going to ask you to put those in the question and answer function. So that's what I will check when I'm going through questions and answers. It will be too difficult to go through all the chat, I think. So I'll just check the Q&A function. So we've got to 3 minutes. So I'm assuming that everybody that's on time and has wanted to come in is in. So I'm now going to share screen and bring up a presentation and introduce myself. Now, that's what I want to share. Can you tell me in the chat if you can you tell me in the chat if you can see my slides? So there should be a screen saying using your translation skill, using your language skills to translate for the EU. You can see that, lovely. Okay. Well, right, I'll start the presentation. So my name is Paul Kay. I work as a translator for the European Commission in the Directorate General for Translation. That's the name of the translation service of the European Commission, DG Translation for short, or DGT for even shorter. I'm seeing now, Nora, you're saying there's a box at the bottom right, which we thought we'd got rid of. I'm going to try and minimize those. There are black windows on the screen. Okay, well, that's definitely not going right. How many people I cannot see the slides because of that? Okay, is that better? Are you seeing presenter view on my screen, or are you seeing just a screen full of filled fully with the presentation? You can see the presenter view. Okay, in that case, I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to share again and apologize and hopefully choose the correct screen. How's that? Is that better? Now you should have the full screen and no black boxes. Okay, good, good. Thank God we've got rid of that, because we worked quite a lot to get rid of that problem. So I'm glad it's okay now. Okay, so yeah, European Commission, Directorate General for Translation, DGT for short. I'm a translator. I want to tell you about the work that we do, and then I want to tell you about the opportunities that we have for people like you with language interests, with language skills, to come and work for us. First of all, the language environment that we work in. I'll bring up a slide. At least I thought I was going to. Yes, there we go. Bring up a slide there with some languages in the language of the language, not in English, that I'm sure you'll recognize lots of those. These are the languages that the European Union works with. These are the languages of the countries of the European Union. And so these are the languages that make up the linguistic material that we have to work with. We work between all these different languages. And you will recognize ones that there will be ones that are your native language there. There'll be ones that you know and that you're able to translate from into your native language. But that's the linguistic framework that we're working in, these 24 languages. And these languages are known as, no, sorry, are known as what we call official languages. They're the EU's official languages, sometimes called working or treaty languages. There are 24 of them. I won't go through them all. I think you will know if your language is an EU language or not. But we have 3 languages among those 24, English, French, and German, that we call procedural languages. These are languages that have a sort of an extra status. When we're working internally within the European Union, when we're doing internal business, then those are the 3 languages that we use among ourselves. So those 3 languages have an extra status, and it leads to different needs in terms of translation and also interpreting later that I might touch on. But if you're able to translate into any of the 24 languages that I showed on that slide before, then we have a translation department where we have people translating into that language from the other languages of the EU that you might be able to come and work in. What's the legal basis of this multilingual system? I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, that's the rule book for how the European Union works, says that citizens, EU citizens, have a right to address the official EU bodies. So that's things like the European Parliament or the European Commission or the European Court of Justice. They can address those in any of the EU's 24 official languages and receive a reply in that language. And then Council Regulation Number 1, 1958, the first law that the EU adopted, was about language, and it says regulations and other documents of general application, which just means laws, shall be drafted in the official languages. And what that means is that any law that the European Union introduces that covers all the 27 countries in the EU has to appear in equivalent versions in all 24 languages of the EU. And of course, so both those requirements, legal requirements, create a lot of work for translators and interpreters, as I say. And on this slide on the left-hand side in the red ball there, you see that we have, across the institutions of the European Union, we have about 4,000 translators working on staff. So 4,000 people like me working in offices in Brussels or Luxembourg translating documents. We have about 800 interpreters. Now, our interpreters are organized and managed separately, and I won't talk about interpreting. I know our interpreters have got separate presentations as part of the language show, and perhaps you've already heard them speak. I'm just going to talk about translators. On top of that 4,000 staff translators, we also have a pool of external freelance translation capacity. So people that don't work for us on salaries in offices, but work for us through agencies and so on. And I'll touch on that as well. And that's another way in which you might be able to work on the material that we need to translate. Now, the EU institutions, there are the different bodies that make up the governing structures of the European Union. So I said that I work for the European Commission, this first one here. You will have heard, no doubt, of the European Parliament. Perhaps you'll have heard of the Council of the European Union. That's where ministers from different countries, the 27 countries, meet. There are other institutions that are less well known, but also make up the governing structures of the European Union. And they all have, to a large extent, they all have their own separate translation services. But the recruitment, to a large extent, is unified, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. I happen to work for the European Commission's Translation Service, and that happens to be the biggest in terms of the number of staff. But it may be that if you apply to come and work for us in the European Union as a translator, it may be that you will end up working for the European Parliament or the Council or the Committee of the Regions or the Court of Justice. But I only have insight into the European Commission because that's where I work. And so I'm going to talk in detail, a bit more detail in the next few minutes about what it's like to work there. So the European Commission, what is the European Commission? The European Commission is the body that proposes new legislation for the European Union. It doesn't approve the legislation, that's done by the Council of Ministers and the European Parliament. But the European Commission is the body that decides what laws it thinks might be needed, new laws might be needed. It drafts the laws and then it presents them to the European Parliament, the Council of Ministers, and then they debate and make changes and adopt it and so on. That's the first job of the European Commission. But when those laws are adopted, another job of the European Commission is to supervise compliance with that law by the member states. So that's the main two jobs it has. And it's made up, the European Commission at the very top, of 27 members, one from each of the member states of the European Union. So there are 27 people on this photograph, and in the middle, you probably recognize Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission. She's the one that you'll see in the news all the time, but she's the head of this 27-member body that's at the top of the European Commission. But underneath that, there are lots and lots of civil servants like me, whose job is working on particular policy areas or doing particular tasks. And there are, I don't know how many, 20, 25,000 people working in the European Commission to do those things. So assisting them is the translation service that I work in. So the Directorate General for Translation has about 2,000 staff. About 70% of them are translators. About 2/3 are women. Just under 45% are based in Brussels. I'm based in Brussels, which is where I'm speaking to you from this evening. But actually, most of the staff of our translation service are based in Luxembourg, which is where a lot of staff that work for the European Union work, even though Brussels is better known as the capital of the EU. A lot of our staff work in Luxembourg. Both Brussels and Luxembourg are very nice places to live and work. Those staff are arranged into this organization chart, and that's all very complicated. You don't really need to look at it in detail. The only reason I put it up is to show you that we arrange our staff essentially by language department. So you see here under translation, you see different languages, and they correspond to language departments, and all our translation into that language, all our staff doing that, they're in one language department. We didn't always arrange our translators by target language in this way. We used to arrange our translators by subject area. So you would have all the agriculture translators who are from different languages translated into and out of different languages. But a few years ago, we rearranged, and now we arrange our translators into language departments. I work in the English language department, which means that I translate into English, exclusively into English. I don't translate into any other language, but I translate from various languages into English. And again, whatever your favorite language is to write, to translate into, there is a translation department that you at some point might be able to apply to come and work in. If you can translate from 2 EU languages into one of these languages, there might be a job for you. But we also have people doing other tasks there on the right-hand side. I'm not going to go into that detail. How are each of the language departments structured? Well, they are divided then into 2, 3, or 4 more specialized units, translation units in the department. And that work then is organized by subject area. And so the different directorates general, DGs for short, that specialize in different areas, each unit in the translation department will deal with that Directorate General's subject matter. So the unit that I'm in, for instance, deals with agriculture, energy, transport, climate policy, and some others as well, but they're the main ones. Some of our translators, as well as translating, they have other designated operational roles. They do some workflow management tasks or training tasks or quality management tasks. We have some people who are translators whose job it is to liaise with our freelance translation capacity that I mentioned earlier on. And then we have managers and secretarial support staff, again, as I'm going to show you. So I mentioned subject area in that second bullet point. What kind of subject areas do we deal with? Well, we deal with all the different subject areas that the European Union has any interest in or contact with, and that's a lot more than I can put on the screen. But top left is humanitarian aid, foreign aid. On the right there, I think that's supposed to be energy policy, chemicals regulation, for instance, energy, environment policy at the bottom. Agriculture policy is a huge area of EU activities. So all the different policy areas that the EU is involved in, our translation service has to handle documents in those subject areas. And you don't need to have deep specialist knowledge of those subject areas when you join, although it's nice if you do. But by working on our documents, you do start to develop specialities in these different areas. So I'm very comfortable with agriculture, environment, energy, transport policy, that kind of thing, because they're the kinds of documents now that I tend to specialize in. How much translation do we get through? So figures for last year, 2022, those 2,000 or so staff in DG Translation, we translated 2.6 million pages. And this is the trend over the last year. So the first column there is from 2010. And it's gradually gone upwards. It went slightly down from 21 to 22. But yeah, at the moment, we're over 2.5 million pages annually that we produce. Now, the columns have got two colors, orange and green. The orange, that's the amount of pages that our in-house translation staff translated. So the people working like me, working in an office in Brussels or Luxembourg. And then the rest, so last year, about 37% of our output in terms of our pages translated was done by our freelance translation staff, our contractors, our external translation contractors that I mentioned. That figure's gone down a fair amount, I think, in 2023, but we don't have the final figures in until the end of next month. That dotted line, that dotted red line, shows the total number of in-house staff, which has gone down a little over the last 12, 13 years. The number of our staff is going down for budgetary reasons, but that doesn't mean that we're not recruiting new people. And again, more on that shortly. So we produced 2.6 million pages of translation into various languages. What were the source languages for our translators? What languages are they translating from? This shows trends in those figures over the last few years. 90% of the documents that DG Translation translates are in English. These are documents that are drafted by our staff in other departments of the European Commission, generally in English, and then they have to be translated into other languages. But there is a decent amount of documents that come into the translation service in other languages. You see others, and then French and German. And the department that I work on, the English language department, deals with these at the bottom, because obviously we're not doing English into English translation. So that's the target language. This chart, I'm going to have a few charts. Sorry if you're not a chart person, but I'm going to have a few charts in the next few slides, sort of breaking down the work so that you can see where our demands are for our languages and language skills and so on. This is the 2.6 million pages broken down into the target language. So if you see, we translated more pages into French, and then to German, then to English, then Spanish, than any other language. And actually what this corresponds to, because our translators are arranged by translation, by language department, that column there under FR, if you can see the language codes at the bottom, that essentially is the output of our French language department that translated into French. So last year, our French department translated more pages than any other department. So if you're somebody that translates into French, there's a lot of work for you there to come and contribute to at one day, perhaps. The second column is German, and then the third is English. That's I contributed to some of those pages. If you imagine these columns as physical piles of paper documents that were translated into that language. But look at all the other languages, the languages that you might think are more exotic, less common, more obscure, right down to MT, Maltese. We produced over, well, nearly 100,000 pages of Maltese last year. So really, in all the different languages, we have a lot of work to translate into those languages. There is a difference between the English language department in the third column, that's its output, and the other language departments. The English language department, as I'm going to show you in a chart soon, its source languages are really from all the other languages, whereas these other language departments that are translating around 100,000 pages into those languages, the vast majority of their translation is from English into that language. So if one day, was it Nora, if you end up working in the Hungarian language department, translating into Hungarian, most of your work would be English into Hungarian. But if you speak one of those languages, if you can translate into any of those languages, you see there's a lot of work for you to potentially come and contribute to there. But for the rest of this introduction to DG Translation, I'm going to talk about the English language department, just because that's the one that I work in and the one that I have knowledge of. So I'm going to tell you now a little bit more about the English language department. So ENLD, EN for English, LD for language department. So our main task is translating documents from EU member states. This is material that is sent by the governments of the 27 countries of the EU to the European Commission. If you think back to that, one of those early slides I showed you, I said that the governments of the member states have the right to communicate with us in their language. So when they send material that they have to send, like reports, updates, whatever, whenever they want to communicate with the European Commission, they can use their language, and they do. So if the Slovak government wants to send a letter to the European Commission, they will send a letter in Slovak. But the person that needs to read and deal with that letter in whichever department, let's say it's in the agriculture department, they will probably know a few languages, because a lot of our staff know different languages, even if they're not in the translation service, but they might not know Slovak. And so to be able to read that language, to read that communication, they ask for it to be translated. And they can ask it to be translated into English or French or German, those three internal working languages that I mentioned. But most of the time, they generally ask for it to be translated into English. And so that's why the English language department has a lot of material that originates from the member states. And that means that we get to translate into English from the 22 other EU languages. Apart from Irish, our Irish language department handles any translation from English into Irish and Irish into English. But apart from the special case of Irish, the English language department translates from the other 22 EU languages. So among our staff, we have people between us that can cover all those combinations. And we deal with documents that cover the full range of EU policies that I showed you on the slide earlier. Last year, we translated just over 100,000 pages. 33% of that was outsourced to our external contractors. The figure this year is a lot lower than that. We have 3 units. 2 are in Brussels. I'm in one of the Brussels ones, and we have one in Luxembourg. And I totted up earlier today the number of staff we have. So as of today, we have 81 translators, 2 terminologists, 4 managers, and 15 support staff. I showed you earlier, well, those 100,000 pages that we translated into English, which are the languages that we translated from? And this chart shows a breakdown by our source language. So German is our biggest source language, the column on the left here. So something like 13,000 pages we translated last year from German into English. The blue part is done by our in-house translators, people like me, although I don't translate German. And the pink part is that done by our external contractors. The next biggest language was Spanish, then French, then Italian, then Greek. You might be surprised. We have a lot of Greek to translate. Sorry, didn't mean to do that. And then the next biggest language after that is Romanian. You see, we translated 6,000 pages of Romanian into English last year. Again, divided between our in-house staff and our external contractors, translation contractors. And it goes down all the way to, well, if you go down MT at the end there on the right-hand side, we don't get much Maltese to translate from. The Maltese government tends to write to us in English. But the Estonian government sends us material, and it's other than Maltese, it's our smallest language. But if you look, that's still almost 1,000 pages that we have to translate from Estonian into English. And among those 81 translators that translate in our English language department, there are only 5 of us that translate from Estonian into English. I'm one of them, but between us, we have to deal with that 1,000 pages translating into English. So we need people that know how to translate from all these different languages. Let me show you the next slide. We also translate from some non-EU languages, but much lower levels. This shows last year's figures. MK, I think, is Macedonian. Most of that was outsourced, but also Norwegian, Turkish, Chinese, Russian, SR Serbian, Icelandic, Ukrainian, Arabic, and Catalan. So we do have some in-house capacity in those languages as well. Now, if you take those languages that we need to be able to translate from, and the in-house capacity that we have, I said that we have only about 5 people that are able to translate from Estonian into English. We have probably 60, 70, probably more than that can translate from French into English. And based on our in-house capacity in different languages, and then the demand that we have to translate different languages, we come up with this graph, which shows our surplus and deficit languages. It shows that we have more French capacity than we need, but we don't have as much in-house Romanian or Greek or Bulgarian or Hungarian capacity as we need. That doesn't mean that if you translate from French or from Spanish or from Danish, that doesn't mean that we won't recruit you. Don't worry about that. Don't worry about that. What it does mean is that when we have translators on staff, when we are teaching them new languages, because one of the things we have is very good training programs for people to add languages. These are the languages that we tend to train people in. So I learned Hungarian through internal language courses, and I now translate Hungarian. I did the same with Estonian, and I'm currently learning Greek, so that eventually one day I can translate documents from Greek. And that's because these are the languages where we need more capacity. It also means that if you have some knowledge of those languages, even if you don't yet translate from them, but if you're learning them or if you're interested in them, make sure you put that on your CV, because that's very valuable when it comes to recruiting people. But I repeat, if the languages that you translate from are the ones that you see in the green columns, that does not mean that you've no chance of being recruited by us. But it just shows you, if you're thinking of learning a new language, the ones in red are the ones that are of value to us. I'm going to skip through the next couple of slides. They show the various products and services that we offer, just to say that we don't just do simple translation, we do other tasks as well. We use various tools. Again, I'm going to skip this just for time reasons. You will recognize some of those tools. And if you come to work for us, the ones that you don't know, you will be able to learn to use. We have very good training in-house on different subject areas, lots of IT-related training, language training, as I said. VTS stands for Visitor Translating Scheme, where we send our translators out to different member states to give presentations for a week. I did one of those last year in Estonia. So that's the kind of thing you can do. I'm showing you these slides just to show you that if you come and work for us, you won't be just sitting in front of a computer all day translating. You get to do other things. The same slide with this, our translation service, the Commission's translation service, has lots of outreach activities. You may know some of these, but they involve schools, they involve universities, they involve lots of other stakeholders and actors in the translation sector. And again, our staff get involved with these initiatives, and it makes the working day more interesting. For instance, Translating Europe, we organize a big conference every year. Some of you may know, because that conference has just been going on. It finished this afternoon, and I was at that today and yesterday and the day before. So this is just showing you that there's lots of variety in coming to work for us as a translator. It's not just sitting translating. I'm going to skip that as well. That just shows you that the cost of translating is not as high as some people might think. So a few minutes now on how to come and work for us. We have basically 5 routes in to come and work for us. There are permanent jobs, working on a permanent contract, staff basis, known as an EU official. Temporary staff, contract staff, they're quite similar. External contractors or freelance translators, as I've mentioned earlier, or trainees, or stagiaires, as they're called, sometimes in French. I'm going to go through these quickly one by one. The permanent staff, the temporary staff, and the contract staff, they are all people who are based in our offices. So they come to work in Luxembourg or in Brussels, and they work in our offices on a monthly salary. And I'm not going to go through detail here. There's some information there on the starting salaries, monthly starting salaries for the different types of salaries. Don't have time to go through that level of detail, but in the world of translation, that's pretty good. We offer good leave entitlements. The work is varied and challenging, as I hope I've shown. You have scope to shape your career. If you come and work for the translation service, you don't have to stay in the translation service your entire career. Once you're in and you've done a couple of years, you then have the ability to go and apply for jobs in the rest of the European Commission or the other EU institutions. There's an open job market there. So people often come in, work for a few years as a translator, and then they apply and do other work in other departments, and then perhaps sometimes they come back. It's obviously a multicultural, multilingual working environment, people from all over, and the working time arrangements are quite flexible. What is the eligibility for translators for all those contract types? So those first three, the people working on staff, you have to be an EU citizen. If you don't have an EU passport, or you haven't got an EU passport yet, you can't apply to work for us as a staff translator. It's simply, you need to be an EU citizen to work on a staff basis for the European institutions. You need to have knowledge of 3 official EU languages, so 3 of those 24 I showed earlier. So for instance, mine are English, the language I translate into, and then when I first started working, they were French and Slovak. Now I've since learned more languages and I translate from more languages, but they were the 3 I started with: English, my native language, French and Slovak. You need to have a full university degree, but it can be in languages, but it doesn't have to be. It can be in another field. I don't have a language degree, for instance. You don't need to have a postgraduate qualification in translation. I don't have one of those, but it's very helpful if you do. I won't go into detail, but if you have one of those, or if you're planning to go for one of those, I certainly would not dissuade you. But it's not a requirement to apply to work for us. You have to have done any military service obligations, though. So taking that first category, the permanent staff, you apply at the website of what's called the European Personnel Selection Office, the recruitment office for the European Union institutions, and that's their website there. This is probably the most important part of the talk. Go to that website, get to know it. There's a huge amount of information there. When we are recruiting, we recruit through a competitive testing procedure, and that's where we announce that we're doing these testing procedures at that website and in the official journal of the European Union as well, but mainly at that website. So you should really familiarize yourself with that website. You go to that website, create an account, and you apply online. And you can create an account now, even if there isn't a selection procedure for you to apply for yet. Many of you will know that there is quite a complex testing procedure when we have these selection procedures. That is now being overhauled. I'm not going to give any detail about the new system because it's not been fully settled yet. But there's more information at the EPSO website, or there will be shortly. But this year, we're changing the recruitment procedures. The big news, and this is something we haven't been able to say for a while, is that we expect to be recruiting staff translators in 2024. We don't know when yet. And the languages we expect to be recruiting translators for are into English, French, Spanish, Italian, Greek, Dutch, Danish, and Maltese. If you translate into any of those languages from 2 other EU languages, then next year, all being well, there will be a recruitment procedure for you to apply for. If you're applying into the competition to translate into English, then you should be able to choose from any 2 EU source languages. In the past, this wasn't the case. So for instance, if you can translate from Spanish and Portuguese into English, you should be able to apply, or Czech and Slovak into English, or Romanian and Hungarian into English. For the other languages, if you translate into any of the others, then one of your 2 languages will have to be French or German as a source language. And as I say, there are new testing procedures. Check the EPSO site when the information comes out. There'll be a lot more detail on it. Temporary staff, I'm not going to say much about these. These are people who work on staff, but they're selected and recruited by individual institutions, sometimes with support from EPSO. But the details vary. There should be more information at that link. We also recruit contract staff. And again, I'm not going to give any detail other than to encourage you to go to these pages and fill in a profile and give us information about yourselves. And that is another potential route that you can be recruited through to come and work for us as a translator. I talked about our external contractors, our freelance translators. We have just completed a recruitment procedure for those. So again, I'm not going to say much because there won't be an opportunity to apply for that for the next few years, but there's more information at that link if you want to find out more about that for the future. And then the final option is to work for us as a trainee. Traineeships last for 5 months. We have 2 intakes a year, starting in March and October. They're for university graduates only, so you have to have graduated. They're for EU citizens generally, but there is a limited number of places for non-EU nationals. You have to be able to translate from at least 2 EU languages into a 3rd EU language, like our translators do. And there's a monthly grant, and that's the amount that you get per month. Go to that link, and again, you will find a lot more information about the traineeship process and how to apply. But I would encourage you to apply for those. I would say 2 things. Number one, it isn't a guarantee of a more permanent job with us afterwards, but it gives you a huge amount of experience and it gets you known in the system. And if in the future you are successful in one of our recruitment competitions, then people know who you are and they know your work. And the second thing I'd say is when you're applying, please, please, please be very, very careful to make sure all of your details are correct. The people who deal with the applications are often frustrated because if there are any details that are missing in the application procedure for our traineeships, they have to exclude people, even if those people look from all the rest of their details, they look like they would be perfect candidates for us. If there's only something missing, or if there are some inconsistencies in dates and discrepancies and so on, they are automatically excluded from the system. So please be very, very careful when you're putting your details in and applying for our traineeships. And I think that's it. There are some links there for our social media where you can get more information on us. But that's it for the presentation that I've got. There are my contact details if you want to follow up. And I think you'll be able to look at the slides again, so you should be able to get all the information. Well, we're nearly at the end of the session, so we're not going to have too much time for questions, but I'm just going to start going into questions now. I will stop sharing my screen so that you should be able to see me in bigger Technicolor. I'm going to go to the Q&A. So if you want a question in there, put it in the Q&A. I see 4 at the moment, and let's see how many I can get through before we're cut off by the organizers. Chris Hughes says, I was interested to hear that you sometimes also translate from and into languages other than the 24. Are you actively building contingency capacity in languages from candidate member states or potential ones? Like Albania, North Macedonia, and so on. Now, I think I recognize that name from Twitter, and I know you know Albanian, Chris. Not actively. I think we do have a little bit of in-house capacity, but at the moment, as far as I know, we're not actively recruiting. Although when we are recruiting, for instance, next year, I think languages like Albania, Macedonian on a CV would be a factor that people would take into account. So it looks very good on a CV. So certainly don't hide it. Thanks for that, Chris. Sergio asks 2 questions. First, do you see English disappearing from the languages needed in the EU as a result of Brexit? The short answer to that is no. I used to have a slide on it, and I used to explain in detail why that is. If we're not cut off, I might come back to that, but the answer is no. I don't see it at all, and nobody does really. Is there a way to get the slides? I don't think there's a way. I mean, you've got my contact details. If you want to email me, I can send you a PDF version of them, but you should be able to go in and watch the presentation again if you want to look at the slides. somebody called Guest says, is there likely to be freelance recruitment call in 2024? Not for the European Commission. I said that we were just one of the institutions that has translation services. It may be that the other translation services have freelance recruitment next year, but I simply don't know. On one of my first slides, there was a hyperlink to a general page about translation in the European Union, and that has links to all the pages from the other EU institutions, not just the European Commission. So if you look back again at the slides or the presentation, go to that link, and from there you'll be able to go into the pages and information about freelance translation recruitment that the other EU institutions have. I only know about the European Commission's recruitment procedures, and we're the biggest of the translation services. And we closed ours. We had a recruitment exercise ongoing this year. In fact, it's still ongoing, but you can't apply for it anymore. So that's that, Guest. Is it possible to translate into a language that's not your mother tongue, Martina? Yes, it is, Martina. When you apply for our translation competitions, as we call them, we test you and your translation ability, but you don't need to prove to us what your mother tongue is. If you tell us that you translate into English, then we simply trust you, and we'll give you a test. And if you pass the test, then you're good enough for our purposes. And so, for instance, in the English language translation department that I work in, English happens to be my native language, but I have several colleagues who translate into English whose mother tongue, native language isn't English, but they have passed all the tests to be able to translate at the level that we need into English. And they're often very helpful because they have obviously a native language ability in the languages that we translate from, so they're very useful in that sense. So yes, it is possible. So you can apply for multiple translation competitions, so you can enter more than one. I'm not sure you can enter more than one at a time, but you can keep applying to as many as you like. Even if you're unsuccessful in the first, you can apply. I've applied across my career. I applied for 4 and I failed in 3. And then it was only in the 4th one that I was successful, which happened to be the translation competition. So that's another thing I say to people. Keep applying. Don't be put off if you fail in the first one that you apply for. Keep applying. The next question, is there a maximum age to apply for a permanent position? No, there isn't, other than recruitment age, which I think is something like 65. So no, don't think this is just something for 20 and 30 or even 40 somethings. We recruit people who are at the older end of the spectrum where I am. I was nearly 40 when I was recruited to work as a permanent translator for the European Union. So no, there isn't. There isn't a maximum age limit other than the retirement age, which I think is 65. So if you are in your 60s, perhaps look into that a little bit. But other than that, don't be put off by applying to us. Good, we're getting through a few here. We're not being cut off. How does AI change the work as a translator? That's Martina again. Well, the conference that I mentioned, the Translating Europe Forum that's been going on these last 3 days, in Brussels, but also online. That was one of the major topics of discussion. It's changing it a lot. And I'm not going to go in detail in here. I'm quite a fan. To me, it's helping me do my job rather than hindering me doing my job. For me, it's also not removing the satisfaction of doing my job, although I've got some colleagues who are less enthusiastic about it. But if you go to the Translating Europe Forum, there's a website there. I don't know whether it'll be possible to access the material. There's a lot of talk and discussion there about how it's affecting the translation sector. I think the short answer is, if you're not prepared to engage with and learn how to use AI and machine translation services, then you might not last long in the sector. We won't be replaced by machines, but we will be replaced by translators who are better able to use machines to do their job, is a nice way of putting it that a colleague of mine has a habit of saying. What do you do when you have a visitor from another country outside the EU? I'm not sure. When you say a visitor, I'm not sure what you mean by a visitor. And that's an anonymous attendee. But if you want to put in there what you mean by that, I mean, we have people that visit our offices from all parts of the world. And I guess all they need is a visa to enter Belgium when they're coming to visit our offices in Brussels. Right. Okay. Kara, I'll come back to the anonymous one about Chinese, but Kara says, will I be considered when applying for the traineeship if I have a French titre de séjour and a British passport? Check with the traineeship webpage. There is a frequently asked question there, and there may be links so that you can ask that more detailed question. I'm not involved in recruiting people for the traineeships, so I don't know. I'm pretty sure that for our permanent staff positions, the titre de séjour is not sufficient. You need the passport. Whether that's the same for the traineeship, I don't know. Please check there. I suspect it might be, but I don't want to say that for sure. So please check. Okay, there's a question at the bottom about the testing. I'll come to that. Somebody says, do you have any opportunities for those who can translate from Chinese to English? The short answer is yes, we do. We do have an in-house translator who specializes in Chinese into English, but just one. In other words, that position comes up very rarely. But yes, we do have one person who works on staff and translates into Chinese from English and vice versa. The rules still apply for that in that you need to be an EU citizen. So whoever we might consider for that work still has to be an EU citizen. Okay, at the bottom, anonymous attendee says, are the translation tests completed with online resources or just a dictionary or nothing? Oh, sorry. Can you give more details about the test? Sorry, Zofia. Oh, Zofia, that was the first one that came up. Can I give more details about the test? Okay, I'll give a little bit more detail, but the EBSO website is the best place to go for more detail. But we have a series of tests that test your verbal, arithmetic, and what's the other one? Logical reasoning. We have a comprehension test that tests your knowledge of your second foreign language. No, sorry. We have a comprehension test that tests your knowledge of your first language, which is usually your mother tongue, and your third language. So in other words, your second translation language. And then we have a translation test and a revision test that tests the language of your second language, which is your first foreign language, your first translation language. So that's as much detail as I want to give right now. But there will be more detail. If it's not already there, then more detail will come up on the EBSO website. But you have to do a translation test at the first stage to be able to qualify to be recruited by us. When we are then looking through all of the people that have passed all the tests, it's then possible that we might give you an additional test, an additional translation test for your second source language. But the initial test will only test your translation ability from your first foreign language. I hope that's enough to be going on for now, Zofia. Lorenzo says that interpreters at the European Parliament are given 5 years to learn to interpret from additional language. How much time are translators given to add one more language to their repertoire? Well, there's no time limit. They're actually allowed to do it at their own pace. So our translators, at least in the English language department that I work in, we start to translate when we're comfortable translating. We have we have our work distribution system is a self-service system. So we take work in areas and from languages that we're comfortable in. So there's basically a big pot of work, and we go in and we decide what we want to work on that day. And if we want to work on a language that we're a little bit less comfortable in, but we know therefore it will take a little bit more time and we might need a little bit more help from colleagues who know the language better, we can do that. So as long as we want, essentially. And there are cases of people that have done the classes in a language, but eventually they don't feel comfortable translating from that language. They might try to, but they decide that they don't think their quality is good enough in that language, and eventually they don't translate from that language. That's very, very rare, but sometimes it happens. So in other words, there's no pressure, Lorenzo. And yes, now the anonymous attendee said, are the translation tests completed with online resources or just a dictionary or nothing? You're allowed to use dictionaries in the translation tests, or you have been in the past. Each time we announce that we've got a new recruitment procedure, then the rules for that recruitment procedure are decided, and they may vary from procedure to procedure, but they're announced at the same time. So I don't want to be prescriptive and tell you exactly how it will be for the ones, for instance, that we will be announcing next year. But for the translation tests, in the past, we have always allowed a dictionary, because of course our translators use dictionaries intensively. But I'm pretty sure you won't be able to use machine translation systems. But I don't know. I mean, because we do use them in our work, maybe you will in some way. But that level of detail will be given to you when we announce that we are holding these translation competitions. Thank you, Paul. Is anyone, or organizations, universities, offering to prepare to pass this multifaceted test? Well, universities that, or other organizations such as translator associations that offer translation qualifications, I imagine that they provide training that will give you a better chance of passing the tests involved in our recruitment competitions. I know that there are some third-party commercial organizations that offer to train you in the particular kind of tests that we have. So the multiple choice, verbal, numerical, and logical reasoning tests that form part of the testing process. Yes, there are commercial organizations that will offer to help you with that. We can't offer any recommendations, and it's so long since I did my recruitment competition that I can't remember which ones I used. I mean, I think I just used a book and practiced using books, and I'm sure they still exist as well. But if you go to that EPSO website, so eucareers.eu, or just Google EU careers and you'll get to it, there are a lot of sample tests on there as well, so you can see the kind of thing that you'll have to do, so that you can get used to the sort of thing that you would have to do in the test, and then you can see, then you could look online to see if there are organizations or sources of information on that kind of test. I think we've gone through all the questions. Lorenzo says thanks. So that's everything in the Q&A as far as I can tell. I apologize if I've missed any scrolling through those, but let me just see if there are any others. So somebody says, do candidates for the CAST translator exams need to be invited, or does it work like AD5? I think you have to, yes, you have to first of all enter your details there, and then you are invited to sit tests. Yeah, so it doesn't work like the AD5, the AD competitions. Yeah. So, but you need, your details need to be in there to start with. So again, for the CAST, and if you're not sure what I'm talking about, look at the presentation again, or at the EU Careers website, you will see information. That's for the contract agent selection. Go there, create a profile, put your information in. I think I've gone through everything. So I will look at to see if there's anything in the in the chat. I see that somebody says, Paul, I'm a freelancer and I previously tried to find where to tender for freelance services and became completely lost on the commission website. Is there a direct link you can make available? Let me see what I can do. I can, in the chat, and this is very useful, I'm going to show you, I'm going to put a link to our existing contractors. So for that, this is for our contractors, our current contractors, and this set of contractors is coming to an end, and we're currently in the process of recruiting for new contractors. Actually, if you go to that link, those of you that work freelance, you'll be able to search there by language combination, and you'll be able to see an indicative amount for how much we pay per page for those language combinations. And it's also a list of the current contractors there. That's all public information. Whether you decide to contact those contractors and offer your services to them because you know that they have a contract for us, that's up to you. That's nothing to do with us. So that's the list of our current contractors. I will, let's have a look. I will see. No, I don't have anything immediate, but if you go to the link that I'm going to put in the chat there's more information about the previous call for tenders, but any future ones, which are going to be a few years yet, because I think it's usually 3 or 4 years on the cycle. So you're looking at really waiting another 3 or 4 years for the next recruitment procedure for freelance translators will be on that same page or around that page. So that's where you can dig around. So I hope I've taken you to a little bit closer. Thank you for the thanks in the chat. Are there any more questions that anybody wants to put? If not, then I will, oops, Q&A. No, I don't see any more in the Q&A. And if there's nothing else in the chat, then I'll say thank you for tuning in. We've gone well over time, but I hope that I've given you everything. So somebody said, can you post the link in the chat? I've put 2 links in there. Which link is it that you mean? That person who's just put the last comment in saying, can you post the link? So the link to the freelance portal, let me try again. There is a link earlier there, but actually here we go. I've got a yeah, I've got one. Here's a better link for you. That if you go there, that will show you to take you to a link to the ongoing freelance recruitment procedure, which, as I said, is closed. So there's no chance for you to. I'm posting it in the chat. The person that's asking, so it's webinar chat. Can somebody else confirm that they can actually see the link in the chat? Because yeah, I'm not sure why that is. Okay. That's because I've got it set to hosts and panelists. I'm terribly sorry. There it is. Let me, in that case, so that's the link to the freelance recruitment procedure that's just closed. Okay, and the link to the document that shows you our current contractor list is here. If you are a freelance translator, I think you will find that document very interesting. And there will be a similar document posted in the same area when we have finished this current recruitment process. So when we have a list of new contractors, there will be a list of new names, and there will be a list of the scales, so the upper and lower amounts that we pay per page to those contractors. So you can get an idea, a rough idea of the amount that we're paying per page in different language combinations. And then you have the names of the contractors that are doing the work for us. And as I say, it's totally your business whether you contact them and offer your services to them if you can translate one of those translation pairs. So I think that should be enough. Yes, I'm glad somebody said they couldn't see it, otherwise you would have been going without that information. But you should, if you root around there, you should be able to find out some more information. So I see no more questions in the chat or in the Q&A, and I thank the organizer for letting us go on longer than the time slot that was allocated for us. I hope you found it useful, and please do consider applying to work for us when we've got those opportunities. Apply for a traineeship, go to the EU Careers website, open an account, put your details in, and check it out, so that when we do have a recruitment exercise that we're launching, and if you're eligible, please do apply for it. So thank you very much, and all the best. Somebody's just said in the chat, I know this is the only webinar I'm giving, but since you're in it, I think you'll be able to rewatch it, so don't worry. No, today is the only session that we'll be talking about opportunities to work as a translator for the EU institutions. But you can rewatch it, and it should be the same information the second time around. Okay, thank you everyone, and have a good evening and a good weekend enjoying the rest of the language show. Bye for now.